In the course of time, there has been a great change in our ideas about the nature of the human soul. And in order to have some perspective on the modern attitude, we shall try to trace back to the original concepts and follow down through the principal modifications which have changed our attitudes toward this mysterious part of ourselves. The ancients believed that man's body was a kind of house or receptacle, and that at birth a living being entered into this house. This being was not created with the house, but had a life and existence of its own, a life which it could live apart and separate from body. Also that this life existed prior to the creation of body and would survive it and would live on after the death of its physical house. This led to the concept that there was a difference in value between the outer or physical part of man and the invisible or psychic part. The body was less important because actually it was only a means of communication between an inner principle and the world in which man materially exists. Just as a person, if he found his house was on fire, would run out and save his life rather than perish with the house, so life became more important than any house that it inhabited. And the emphasis was upon the possibility of cultivating and improving the inner life of the individual through material existence or experience. This belief that man lived through a body or in a body, but was not a body primarily, has of course contributed a great deal to our ethics, to our morality, and to our spiritual approach to living. If this being in the body was the real person, then naturally this being within should control the body, and the psychic nature should dominate the material nature in all matters of importance and leadership. However, as time went on, it became more or less obvious that the psychic nature was a mixed blessing. That from within man there can come impulses that are as negative and as materialistic as those of the body. Actually, materialism is not a material or physical thing. It is a state of the soul. Because unless the person in the body held materialistic attitudes, the compound of soul and body could not be called materialistic. By degrees, therefore, also, it came to the conviction of ancient thinkers that practically everything that we regard as physical has its source and foundation in a psychological state. This does not mean that physical conditions have no existence, but it means that our interpretation of them, what we do about them, and the kind of a world we build because of them. These are all strongly psychological. That the grass should be green and the sun should shine and the rain should fall, these are facts. But this civilization that man has built, this strange involved way of life, these customs, traditions, policies, attitudes, our economic theories, our political theories, all these things are not part of nature. They are not part of the great universal diffusion in which we exist. They are not imposed upon us by the dictatorship of space. All these great institutional motions come from within ourselves. Therefore, the fact that we pay rent, and the fact that we like certain kind of furniture or wear certain kind of clothing, all this is due to our psychic nature and not to what we term inevitable realities. Now, we may say that without some kind of psychic pressure, man would have remained a savage forever. That might be true. But of course, there is no creature without some kind of psychic pressure. It follows necessarily that the kind of pressure that is exercised by the inner life tells us the direction in which large motions of society will trend, and also the directions in which personal character will be gradually intensified and matured, or modified and changed if our own attitudes are amended. Thus, to the original idea that the soul was a living being moving into a body, there came modifications. What kind of a being moved into body? In this there is still some uncertainty. It is obvious that we must judge, in the case of man, the nature of his soul by its attributes, by the qualifications which it manifests, by the way in which it acts. Now, if we are to judge, in the case of man, that the quality of his psychic nature is determined by the impulses and pressures which this nature exercises in his objective life, we must come to the conclusion that the human soul is far from perfect. That this psychic life of man is also a growing and maturing thing. That this psychic life is under the laws of evolution. In fact, that what we call evolution for man is very largely the growth of his psychic life, producing as a consequence the apparent changes in his bodily structure. The evolution of form is due to the evolution of life within form, where it is this life which stamps itself upon form and causes the body to gradually develop into the likeness of the psychic pressure behind it. So we now have the concept of the person in the body, the soul entity, not as a perfect and infallible deity, but as a fallible and imperfect creature, capable of temper fits and nasty spells of disposition and the like, capable of being unreasonable and of being ignorant, and also of suffering from innumerable intensities of mind and emotion, which may lead to difficult or even tragic consequences. Still, however, we recognize this entity in the body only rationally. The soul exists because man finds it necessary to explain the mystery of his own subjective life. He knows there is something there. And so by the study of the attributes and manifestations of this thing that is there, he seeks to identify the nature of something which is exceedingly intangible. Gradually in this pattern of thinking also, the theological factors began to appear. The ancients believed, certainly many of them, including the Greeks, the early Latins, most of the Asiatic peoples, that in some way man was made alive by the presence of a spirit within him. And in Genesis it says that God breathed the breath of life into man. Man became a living being. Now this breath of life, this divine breath, the ancients usually regarded as a symbol of spirit. And the question arose, is the theological term spirit identical with the more or less philosophical term soul? It cannot be if we wish to be formal in our thinking. Because if the soul is the Spirit of God in man, then we are confronted with a most embarrassing situation. The Spirit of God in man can become sick, can be extremely unpleasant, can cultivate a variety of vices, can lead the individual to such intensities as hate, or extraordinary passion, or hysteria. Therefore, if the soul is identical with a divine being, then we have to assume that deity is too much like the old concept of a God of jealousies and hates. Nor can we assume that that which is bestowed by God could be wrong, or could be fallible, or could impel us ultimately to destructive action. Yet the soul may do any of these things. And the soul apparently is not capable by itself and of itself of its own spontaneous recognition of God. Therefore, we must question the possibility of the soul and the spirit being given the same general term. The Bible tells us also in one place that the soul that sinneth, it shall die. In another place it says, but the spirit shall return to God who gave it. So I think we have to assume that by spirit we mean the primary and eternal life principle, that by which man becomes alive, a living thing, a living being, and that this spirit manifests most immediately through our experience as vitality, as the tremendous energy by which all other things are accomplished, and that the God in man is a very recondite thing, hidden, deeply removed from our immediate observation, and perhaps primarily responsible for the simple fact, I am. That is, I exist. Consequently, the soul has more to do not with existence, but as qualitative expression of attitudes and feelings. The soul seems, therefore, or the psychic self seems to be the source and root of disposition, of natures and qualities. And from the soul we gain a conditioned kind of life. And according to the Greeks, the soul itself consisted of three parts. One of these was termed the animal soul, which according to the Greeks verged constantly toward identity with body, to become what we might term the appetitive soul, or the soul that is forever seeking satisfaction through gratification. This is the soul which we consider intensely personal and very often profoundly selfish. Then there was a second part of the soul, which was called the rational or human soul, that was seated in the middle distance between extremes. And this soul, focusing very largely through the mental-emotional complex, is the soul which causes the human being to be like a human being rather than like anything else. Therefore, it is the soul of the unique humanity in man, the soul by which he is neither God nor beast, but by which he progresses and advances those concerns most natural to his kind. Then the Greeks represented the third part of the soul as a divine being, a creature aspiring constantly through intuition and inspiration to union with the gods, a part of man's psychic life forever verging toward reality, and ever seeking to escape from the bondage of matter. And around these different parts of the soul, legends like Cupid and Psyche, the fables of Eros, were created. And man gradually emerged as required by nature, as his primary objective, to conquer the mystery of his own soul. Thus the hero cycles came into existence, in which by means of a varied symbolism, this valid purpose was emphasized, that the first duty of each person is to solve the mystery of his soul. This is the strange challenge, perhaps concealed under the ancient term, man, know thyself. In any event, it was philosophized, particularly in the great mystery institutions of India and Egypt and Persia, that the road to self-mastery, the road to godhood for man, must lead through the strange psychic fantasy of the soul. That no person, no being could approach reality except through the soul. And that the soul's victory over materiality and physical objectivity was an essential step towards the attainment of inner wisdom. Now, even at an early time, we can more or less rationalize the reason for this attitude. We only have to work with people for a very short time to realize that the average individual is his own worst enemy. That it would be almost impossible for us to be as badly treated by others as we treat ourselves, especially when we are trying to be exceptionally good to ourselves. We have never apparently achieved that rational attitude which is supposed to be so excellent in parents, namely that happy ground between spoiling by catering and indulgence and damaging through extra severity or lack of understanding. Our natural tendency with ourselves is always to be indulgent. If, however, we should develop a peculiar kind of religious fanaticism, we may begin a process of penance that is also equally damaging. Man is not a moderate creature. and between him and any state of security for himself, and any permanent state of security for his world, lies this psychic interval of uncontrolled excesses and intensities. This interval of unreasonable joys and ungrounded fears. This tendency to dramatize everything and to live in a strange half-dream, half-nightmare, made up of all of our false conclusions and immature reactions on thousands of subjects. So the average person is not only damaged by these intensities, but he is prevented by them from seeking the solution to his real problem. Between every person and the truth he sees is himself. He is inclined to think or believe that it's someone else or other conditions. But our ability to understand depends almost completely upon the integration of our own resources. And to the modern man, his psychic nature is not integrated. Now, we sometimes also wonder whether the times we live in are working unusual hardships upon the psychic life of man. I think the answer lies in that more is demanded today of the psychic integrity of the individual than he has available. The purpose of the soul is to sustain man under stress. Yet to accomplish this end, the psychic life must certainly be brought under a rational discipline. It must be organized. It must be matured. It must be given real thought and consideration. It means perhaps then that at this time we have made greater demands upon the psychic life than was previously so obvious. And these demands have revealed to us that in the last 100 years of civilization we have made practically no effort to mature the inner parts of ourselves. We have advanced materially more rapidly than we have advanced psychologically, culturally, or philosophically. The widening interval between our physical program and our ethical conviction, therefore, subjects us to unusual stress and strain for which we are not prepared. The next natural question is that if the soul or psychic self is a mutable being, that is capable of change, and is of its own nature under the law of evolution, how did the ancients believe the growth of the soul was affected? They believed that this growth was the result of the embodiment of the soul, that by a peculiar and wonderful virtue, incarnation in the material world offered exceptional opportunity for the experiencing of the values of psychic consciousness or energy. Now, I think the answer to this lies also in a very simple and rather obvious fact. Suppose you sit down with a piece of paper and pencil, or just in an easy chair, and you begin solving world problems. In about 15 minutes, you can probably straighten the universe right out. You can do it just as the old cracker-barrel philosophers of old did it. And in a short time, you can be saying to yourself, well, why didn't other people think of this simple, inevitable, and infallible remedy? And it will remain infallible, it will remain sufficient, it will remain a 7-day wonder, as long as you keep it quietly inside of your own consciousness. If, however, by some emergency you should try to use it, if you should set to work with it and try to make this simple formula work, you would realize that the ages have been trying to do this very thing since the dawn of time, but nothing happened. That this obviously simple and adequate solution falls to pieces the moment you try to use it. That is why it is always better, when you have those kinds of ideas, to retire from the misunderstanding world and keep them to yourself. Because as long as you can do that, they are very satisfying. The moment you apply them, they do not work. Or even if they have certain virtues in them, they work very slowly over long periods of time. And as most of these solutions, along with innumerable other dreams and hopes of mankind, arise within the psychic nature, it is rather evident that if man lived only in a kind of psychic internal trance, subsisting forever in his own world, then his feelings and his thoughts would always be the truth. That there would never be any way of proving or testing, and the individual would never know whether his emotions were fair or foul. If he has a psychic nature that is deranged, he can retire into it today and lose complete contact with the world around him. But under these conditions, he neither grows nor changes. He neither accepts nor rejects. And psychologically, he's in a state of suspension. A suspension which of itself is not particularly profitable. So the psychic life of man might cause him to come to all kinds of abstract solutions to every conceivable problem. But the facts, the proof, the experience would not be there, not be available. So nature in its wisdom has decreed that the emotional and psychic growth of man should be geared to a sphere of action, a kind of laboratory world in which each individual has the right to test and to try and to learn from experience that which is good. This experience, recorded by the memory and preserved within the records of the psychic nature, gradually builds up a body of wisdom and of understanding and of experience itself, by which man gains a reference framework for future building and learns how he can, by degrees, grow because he possesses a continuity of experience records. Now, this might sound as though it was the answer to everything, and why don't we all start writing and grow? That would be all right if we could convince man of what he is trying to grow to become. Each individual, however, suffers from a series of psychological pressures, and these have come out into society as vast organizations. And even the spiritual quest of man is no longer recognized as a one-purposed activity. So in Christendom we have 500 different sects, each trying to convince us that it has the best way to achieve the spiritual quest for man. In other parts of the world we have a much greater number of divergent opinions. We have many systems of philosophy, and now many schools of science, and even psychology is gradually dividing into innumerable systems each with a point or a particular or a concept about some phase of this important subject. So man, instead of being able to attack the growth of his soul with a solid purpose, cannot even decide with certainty upon a definition for the soul. Nor can he decide immediately what the soul wants or what it needs, nor again how the best way may be to give it what it wants or what it needs. And perhaps most of all, the individual has never learned that the soul may require discipline and that it may have to be prevented from certain actions, and that these preventative measures perhaps must involve intelligence, courage, resource of various kinds, and strength of character. With all this involved problem, we begin to recognize that perhaps we must approach education on two levels: physical and psychological, or body and soul. I do not think any of us would try to take the audacious attitude of trying to educate the spirit, but that the soul and body need culturing is practically a foregone conclusion. So in the education of man, actually all education, theoretically at least, must be achieved by the soul, with the possible exception of certain physical rudimentary habits which become automatic. But geography and history and politics and all these things relate to the sphere of the soul. And so education cultivates the soul in relationship to body. It tells us what we expect the soul to contribute in order that the body will be successful. In other words, we take the soul and we make a clerk out of it. We use the mathematical powers of the soul in order to keep our bookkeeping straight. We use the artistic powers of the soul to dress a window or to prepare commercial art. Or we use the memory of the soul in order to remember the economic records of our organizations. The soul is in this way employed, more or less, by the body. Actually, however, the soul gets into this particular situation a little because the soul, in turn, uses the body as a means of gratifying its own materialistic instincts. The body doesn't want the extravagant things that we buy. The body would prefer to live very simply and back to nature. The body of man would probably be happiest under a tree somewhere. Nearly every other thing that we want or desire is the result of psychic pressure. The desire to be more opulent than our neighbor is pure psychic pressure. Our selection of nearly everything is impelled by the desire to gratify instinct, emotion, impulse. And these are psychic circumstances. But we can perhaps borrow the Greek theory and say that we have made a package out of the animal soul's partnership with body. Therefore, that we are using primarily those lower parts of the soul which verge toward matter and become its animating power. And in these parts, of course, are the fantastic attributes, the particularly stressful, emotional, and amatory, and the negatively critical lower mental. These together constitute a fair picture of the way in which the psychic energy is used in a great number of persons. Now, they may overcome part of these criticisms, but the instinct is still strong. They may never say the unkind word, but they are still quite capable of thinking it. And they may never allow themselves to become hopelessly enslaved by appetites, and yet they are not free from them. So these parts of the soul together unite with the body to form what we commonly know as the personality. Because we are interested only in those parts of the psychic nature which have some direct bearing upon our material objective existence. The partnership of the psychic and the material constitute the basis of our appraisal of what a human being is. And we are very much less interested in his intangible, impersonal relationships with some abstract principle or power. This, of course, leaves the central or human part of the soul to be considered. And here we have a natural tendency in man, a tendency which seems to me expresses itself in the uniquely human institutions with which man is most associated. Institutions originating from hope, faith, and charity. Institutions which have to do with the conscious cooperation of beings, moving by decision into a state of human relationship. Therefore, perhaps the human part of man's psychic life is best expressed by civilization. I don't mean any particular selfishly dominated example of civilization, but civilization in principle. The principle, as Cicero defines it, of men dwelling together in a cooperative state. Cooperating not because of instinct alone, but because of conscious recognition of the importance of cooperation as a virtue in human conduct. This more or less reaches the human level of the soul, the humanity of which the Greeks so often spoke, dividing the soul as they did into these three parts. They also recognized a division about which Plotinus has left us a few words, namely that an individual who lives a purely animal existence is a beast in the world of men, and an individual who lives a purely human existence is a man in a world of beasts. But those who ascend to the contemplation of divine matters, such are men in a universe of gods, and also gods in a universe of men. It's an intricate statement, but at the same time it conveys a general symbolism. So we then go on to consider the relationship of the individual to what might be termed the higher psychic parts of his nature. Those parts which verge naturally and inevitably toward the divine, by which the individual is elevated into the most sublime and sublimated expressions of consciousness. Here we have psychic creativity. Here we have the sphere most often associated with great art, music, sublime religious concepts, wonderful profundities of reflection, meditation and concentration, contemplation of values. The moment the individual begins to expand or enlarge the higher psychic phase of his own life, he begins to explore the universe that lies within him and begins to make available the resources for contact between himself and the larger universal mystery of life around him. Therefore, it was written of old that the upper parts of the soul are the bridge between man and God, even as the lower parts of the soul are the bridge between man and body. And that we must all pass back and forth upon this bridge, but that we should not loiter or linger too long thereon. Thus the soul also begins to take on its position or its meaning or its significance as intermediary between spirit and body. And when we consider man as a triad or a trinity consisting of spirit, soul, and body, the soul becomes the middle ground between the two extremes, therefore the reconciler. And without the soul as a middle distance, the ancient Kabbalists believed that spirit and matter could not meet, and that wherever they meet, it is because of a psychic intermediary that exists in nature, and that this intermediary, like the hypothetical ether of science, which unites energy and matter, is required to explain how pure life can become involved in the absolute negation of form. So in any event, we have a triad now of 3 degrees, spirit, soul, and body. This triad corresponds with the Platonic triad, or as it is more familiarly known, the Socratic, of the one, the beautiful, and the good. Obviously, the one would represent spirit. Perhaps less obviously, the good represents matter, because matter is the source of experience. And as Socrates says, experience is the greatest good. Therefore, the world by which we are taught, or by which we are inspired to learn, is the greater good. Between these two, then, stands the beautiful. And wherever we find this in nature, we find it associated with the soul. And we also find that the beautiful mediating power, representing the psychic life of man, stands in nearly every theology behind the concept of the personalized Savior divinity. The soul becomes the world hero. It becomes the mediator between God and man. It becomes the redeemer, the reformer, the regenerator. And nearly always where there is a psychic myth, there is a myth of death and resurrection. There is the story of the soul that dies in the body, or enters into a state of generation. Or as Plato says, the body is the sepulchre of the soul. And this same thought he expresses again where he says that the soul is contained within the body, as the oyster is contained within its shell. That the body, therefore, is a kind of grave into which the soul dies, and that this death we call birth. For the real physical birth of man is nothing more or less than the descent of the soul into the state of obscuration. And that with the birth of the body, the soul passes into sleep. Also, that the soul returns, according to the Platonists, to this world for a particular experience purpose, namely retribution. That it is here that the soul must experience the consequences of its own irrational instincts and appetites. And because this is the place where what we do returns to us in the term of consequence, this is properly called Hades, or the land of Dis, or death. And actually, this is the perdition which was symbolically blazed by the ancients. The place of our own inevitable compensations, where we must reap as we have sown. The soul then, coming into obscuration and being born into the material world, passes into sleep, drinks of the waters of Lethe, and remains unconscious of its own state until it is gradually released through the growth of body, achieving its principal impulse toward release at the time of adolescence, where it becomes the unseasoned and unrealistic ruler of the growing personality, presenting the life often with excessive problems. This soul going on through material life, comparatively neglected by the individual, grows only by such accidents and incidents as it can define or discover for itself. Only one person in 100,000, perhaps, would actually make a conscious provision for the improvement of his soul. The soul grows merely because man experiences. And man's experienced growth is also because the soul does grow. So by whatever means possible, without intent or plan or purpose, the soul gains certain experiences. It also passes through certain suffering and misfortune, and finally comes to the maturity of itself within body, according to whatever advantages or disadvantages have been available to it. Because it has never received any actual cultivation, the evolution of the soul is not rapid in the life of the average person. And while his body passes through many stages of maturity and age, the soul very often never passes beyond the state of adolescence. This means that the normal maturity man needs for his security is not always, in fact seldom, available to him. What is the reason why man's difficulties involving the soul become so intense in his life? The Greeks believed definitely that the powers or psychic energies of the individual are largely the result of habits. That habits in turn are the perpetual restatement of attitudes until this restatement and its consequence becomes automatic. Today, we demand or call upon only certain resources of the psychic nature. We use the soul principally as a sounding board for intensities. And we are forever calling upon it to vitalize our moods. Or we have moods upon which the soul depends for its expression. And these moods may or may not be appropriate. Socrates therefore pointed out that one of our great problems is confusion, and that the average person's psychic physical compound is in a state of terrible confusion. Confusion because the person himself is totally confused, as everyone must be, who does not know where he came from, why he is here, or where he is going. Confused because he has superimposed upon the essentials of life a wide diversity of unessentials and non-essentials that have become so pressingly significant emotionally and psychologically that they are more real than reality itself. Thus, without patience, without tolerance, without serenity of soul or spirit, without the virtue of quietude or peace of soul, the individual struggles and staggers and strives his way through life. As a result, the psychic availability is called upon only to vitalize and intensify this struggle. Socrates was convinced that the beginning of solution was the ability to relax these relationships and to realize that the soul, in order to orient itself, in order to integrate itself, must operate through what Aristotle calls leisure. The danger of the soul is always its over-intensities, its immediately available flood of psychic pressure. It is therefore most vital that the soul be qualified through relaxation, through leisure, and the cultivation of a certain serenity of spirit. When the soul is relaxed and its pressures have been withdrawn from material things, we can begin to estimate or experience the soul's need of itself. We have been so concerned with what the soul could do for the body and why the soul contributes to a picturesque, if strenuous, material existence, that we have forgotten that the soul is the evolving thing, that it has a purpose of its own, and that that purpose has very little in common with the average uses that we make of psychic energy. So what is the purpose of the soul? Well, probably the purpose of the soul could be again defined as its instinctive need to follow the Platonic rule, namely, to worship the One, love the beautiful, and serve the good. These are the natural desires of the soul. And in this desire, there is no emphasis upon profit. There is no emphasis upon building immortal destinies in the material world. There is no emphasis upon passions and changing styles, competition, or keeping up with the Joneses. These factors are simply not present. But the soul has a life of its own. And by its natural threefold nature, the spiritual part of the soul aspires to venerate the One. The human part of the soul, the middle part, to serve the beautiful, or to love the beautiful. And the lower or lesser part, associated with the body, to give its allegiance to the good, that is, the lawful, the reasonable, and the proper. While it is thus occupied, the soul may be said to be healthy. And it is constantly fed and nourished through the conscious accumulation of experience, which is the banquet of the sages. If, however, man is selfish, narrow-minded, opinionated, or bigoted, experience is no value, because he will interpret out of the experience everything that might have been useful. The soul, then, demands something of the body, and of the mind and of all the parts of itself. It demands honesty. For without honesty, the psychic nature cannot function. That is, it cannot function constructively and for the common good of the person. If then we want to conceive that man has a psychic life, which is of itself important, and that this psychic life is actually that part of man which must sometime become the ruler of his temporal personality, and that actually that the release of man's psychic potential is the basis of world peace, order, harmony, and the experience of religion in the life of men, then we have inducements for the study of the soul and an understanding of its laws and rules. Today, most study of the soul is based upon sick souls, because we are seldom aware of them unless they go into some kind of disorder. We take the health of the soul for granted as we take the health of the body, and are gravely perturbed when our indiscretions cause interference in functions which we have considered to be a birthright, which we do not feel that we have any personal responsibility whatsoever. But we must also study healthy souls and try to understand the place of the psychic life in the total picture of man's existence. Often we find triads set up in ancient philosophy stated in this way: spirit, soul, mind, or spirit, mind embodied. And today there is a tendency throughout modern psychology to assume that thought and emotion are the polarizations of the psychic power, and that therefore man's mind is part of his soul. I think this is due, partly at least, to the lack of clear differentiation in modern scientific research, because as yet the researcher is merely looking from an objective point of view towards something subjective. And as he cannot define this subjective thing, he is certainly not in a condition to stratify it, to give the various parts of it true and complete attention. The tendency, therefore, is to divide man into what you can see, body, and what you cannot see, soul, and let this division stand, considering the fact that we permit this invisible part to be accepted as existing represents a liberality almost beyond scientific demonstration. In other words, they feel that they have gone as far as they can with scientific precision. Actually, there is much to point out that the mind and the soul are perhaps parallel factors, but not identical. Actually, the mind of man is part of his invisible nature, but it is not completely identical with the emotional soul and the psychic nature as we know it. I think that we may say, for example, that the mind of the individual is an evolving entity also, and that under certain conditions, its dependency upon psychic energy is very great, and that this energy may affect certain parts of the mind, and the mind in turn may affect certain parts of the psychic organism, but that we should differentiate to degree at least, between mental and emotional phenomena. They are not identical any more than the phenomenal psychological situation which we call sexual differentiation, which is essentially a mental emotional differentiation, is not a distinct phenomenon. And that therefore, if we wish to take the attitude that the soul is polarized, that it therefore has a rational and an emotional polarization, we should certainly examine the two groups of phenomena with the full recognition that they have a kind of independent existence. Our greatest problem today is the psychic intensity contribution. We have learned, for example, that the mind, if we wish to call it the physical positive polarity of the psychic energy, that the mind is a comparatively impotent creature or being or entity unless it is dramatized or vitalized by emotional energy. Therefore, that emotion leads thought. Thought does not lead emotion. Thoughts do not kill emotions in most instances, but most times emotions kill thoughts. The power of emotion is very much greater. And there are very few people who think continuously or even for long periods of time simply from the pure instinct to think. One individual said, "I have never permitted my emotions to become involved in my thoughts." And you ask him why he has not permitted this. He said, "Because I enjoy thinking." And you can't get away from it. Even to think. You only think because you enjoy thinking. And if you didn't enjoy it, you'd stop. Some people think because they want to best another in an argument. But that again is for a very highly emotional purpose. And this cold, clammy kind of pure intellectualism that we read about is practically non-existent. In fact, you can't find it. You will find some persons more intellectual than others, but usually it is because they enjoy it, or because they like it, or because they get a thrill out of it, or as one individual said, there's nothing as wonderful as mathematics. Well, he has already highly emotionalized the most exact of the sciences. So mind and all of the energies that we associate with it is used principally to sustain and justify emotions. The individual says, "This I believe. Now I will prove it." And he will. And 100 people working with the same problem and working from the same basis will come back with 100 different infallible answers. Because each person will prove not what is true, but what he feels, what he has preconceived to be the inevitable answer. Thus, mind, if it cannot sustain emotion, is penalized by being ignored. And if our thoughts do not please us, we forget them as quickly as possible. Their merit is not so important. Thus, the emotional quotient certainly does dominate the mind, even in the field of pure sciences. And the emotional part of man's nature, stimulated by the interior unfinishedness of his psychic life, carrying the unfinished past with it, the past of man's struggle upward through the various kingdoms and levels of nature, burdened with tremendous atavistic tendencies, and carrying the rebirth record of the unfinished karmic responsibilities. This psychic life moving into embodiment and coming gradually in contact with another pressure, the tremendous external pressure of environment. Combining this with both biological and psychological heredity, we find the average person locked in a conflict for which he has no ready and immediate solution. Religion comes forward then with itself and its purpose, and emerges as medicine for the soul. The purpose of religion is essentially to bring peace to the human soul. And in the effort to do so, it has to demand or require that the individual make his peace with God, or keep the laws and principles upon which the universal life depends. Religion thus stands strongly as the mediating power. The temple was always the place which was between the world and the gods. And this temple, therefore, built in veneration of the deity, was itself a living symbol of the soul. And the rites, rituals, ceremonies, and sacraments of religion are symbolical of processes, alchemical and alchemistical, which must go on within the regenerating power of man's psychic life. This comes then to the idea that for man, salvation means the integration of the soul, the bringing of the soul into the light of its own purpose. The question as to whether the soul itself possesses a true knowledge of its own purpose, any more than the body does, may be of some importance. But we do know that the soul has a dimension that the body does not, and that the soul, as having a larger life than the body, a life extending over greater vistas of time, that the soul, in all probability, has a larger knowledge of its own potential than the body consciousness which we have. The soul, therefore, has advantages if its resources are used. And we also are inclined to assume that the roots of the soul, extending downward into the depths of archetypal space, that these roots are closer to the root of life than are the roots of phenomenal existence as we see outward living. Experience taught man from the beginning that the way of learning was outward, but that the way of wisdom was inward. That by turning to the world around him, man could discover facts. By turning inward, he could discover realities which were greater than facts. And that the only solution to the outward life of man is the voluntary turning inward to explore the mystery of cause, and that no individual can organize his life until he understands the workings of his own internal. How is he to achieve this understanding? He may achieve it to a degree educationally, because the great history and record that we have of humanity is distinguished by a few great outstanding heroes, whom we would term saviors, great teachers, great philosophers founders of systems which have endured to enrich man for thousands of years. And most of these have claimed to personal experience of the nature of this inward search for psychic integrity or reality. Therefore, through the contemplation of their works, Eastern and Western, we may gain an apperception of their method, of their idea, and of their concepts. Also, in each case, these systems include some method, some discipline, by which the individual can validate the conviction he would like to believe. This method tells him simply that if he wishes to prove beyond any question the reality of certain things immaterial or beyond physical analysis, that if he will perform certain actions, he may have the necessary experiences. That only if he lives in a certain kind of life can he actually experience the reality of these doctrines, but that they can be experienced and that they can be demonstrated. So the path of psychic growth, the individual illuminating and perfecting his own soul to achieve the second birth. For unless a man be born again, he cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. And unless the man be born again, means apparently in this case, unless the soul, which was united with the body in material birth, is born again or liberated consciously from the body by a spiritual rebirth, that unless this occurs, the individual is incapable of knowing reality and truth. That the soul must then be voluntarily separated from the body was part of the mystery of alchemy, by which base metals were to be reduced to their principles, and from these essences, separated and purified from body, was to be formed the lapis philosophorum, the stone of the wise man. So the concept of releasing soul led to a variety of beliefs. Nearly all of these beliefs begin in quietude, like the Quakers, or the Sufis and the Dervishes of Islam. The cultivation of internal quietude. Not a quietude that means you sit down and do nothing, but a quietude which means that internally peace has achieved a victory over confusion. You may be just as busy as you ever were, but you are moving from a certain sense of good, of beauty, and of truth within yourself. And this inner peace is such that it cannot be corrupted by some moving or passing incident. If you have achieved this peace, you cannot suddenly blaze into irritation. It means rather the accomplishment of a quietude in which man places the body in a position of receptivity to the psychic life, realizing that the psychic life is superior to the body and has purposes apart from those of body. The mystic attempts to give the soul supremacy over body, and does so by quieting the demands of the objective life and all of the bodily materialistic implications. Buddhism does the same thing. It teaches that the release of the pure energy of the soul is achieved by the simple relaxation of all attitudes which are not basically real. The essential statement of values as being the most conserving and redeeming of all processes. The soul's energy cannot be used constantly for negative purposes and still be available for positive and constructive purposes. Once, however, we redeem this energy or preserve it against waste, against misuse, it becomes increasingly available as a medium of creative expression, an emotion towards the intuitional and higher psychic spiritual faculties of man. Thus the soul was a ladder with 7 rungs, with its lower end resting upon the earth and its upper end pointing to the constellation of the Great Bear, a constellation of stars. It is the ladder of the sense perceptions. It is the realm of the 7 deadly sins, the 7 cardinal virtues. It represents in every case this septenary bridge which unites matter and spirit. And man's purpose is to climb and ascend this ladder or cross this bridge. He might like to reject the invitation to such labor and stay as he is. He cannot, because the pressure of the soul within him will not permit him to so linger indefinitely. Therefore, again, you have 3 paths represented in ancient philosophy leading to wisdom. The lowest of these paths belongs to body, and it is called the path of service, and corresponds in the triad of St. Paul, hope, faith, and charity, to charity. But we have misused the word rather badly, because the original word, which was translated charity, means love, rather than merely bestowal of goods. But service represents man's visible means of expressing his religious instinct. His love of the beautiful, his adoration of the archetype of sublimity, corresponds very closely with his true psychic existence. Beauty, as the basis of organization, resides in the soul. It is because of the soul in man that harmony, beauty, tonal organization, poetry, literature, sculpturing, the dance, all of the arts have come into being, because the arts are man's interpretation of the lawful, and man's experience that the law is beautiful. To the average individual, the laws of nature, like the laws of man, are hard, cold things. But to the wise man, the laws of nature are the most beautiful of all things, because they are forever streaming from the one toward the good, and bestowing and fulfilling the works that are necessary. Man's ability to recognize the universal plan as the most beautiful of all things in nature rises from his ability to integrate and organize his own psychic archetype. Plato tells us that the soul is the most beautiful and symmetrical of all geometric solids in nature. In other words, the soul is a magnificent, perfectly balanced mathematical formula. It is complete order without asymmetry, complete equilibrium, balance in all things, subject in nothing to either privation or excess. being in itself forever sufficient to itself, and being of the nature of an enduring power, and possessing the immediate attributes of a deity. Thus the soul represents, in a way and in a sense, creation in total. It represents the complete emergence of all things from their eternal and inevitable roots. The perfect soul is the flower blooming upon the tree of life. And from this soul flower will ultimately come the seed of the new generation and of the new order of life. But recognizing the soul as a perfect flowering within man, that it is a mysterious proof of all that man has previously experienced, that the soul, like the lotus, has its roots in the darkness of the slime of the primordial Elos, that it rises finally into the light and turns its beautiful blossom toward the sun in adoration, finally opening its petals and revealing the golden heart, the symbol of the 1,000-petal lotus of man's psychic life. The fact that all of these things are represented in the soul nature tells us that it profit man's little if he gain all other things and shall lose his own soul. That the individual's human existence is different from that of the brute, largely because man may choose to live and to develop and to mature the psychic attributes of his nature. If he so decides, he then begins to mature his inner life, placing certain concepts and patterns primary within his nature, and feeling the importance of the ministry of beauty in the service of all other things around him. As he really matures inwardly, therefore, he relaxes. His health becomes better, his intensities become fewer, and energy is available for purpose rather than the overwhelming of purpose. As the psychic life has a chance to grow and mature through the building of experience patterns into its own nature, it also draws out from its depths those oracular truths which the soul has made available through the long evolutionary growth of its own nature. The soul does not and cannot understand the mystery of spirit, but the soul can bridge between man, the thinker, and God, the reality. The soul, therefore, enables man to gradually ascend in the refinement of his comprehension and his understanding, until he begins to learn more and more about the root of himself. And while the soul cannot unfold to him the full mystery of divinity, it can bring him nearer and give him mystical illuminations and extensions of consciousness, which may at times seem almost complete revelations of God. Actually, however, the soul must again lead the way to that which is superior to itself. Now, man may feel that these purposes and these activities are rather abstract and out of his normal living. But we all know how rapidly the days fly by, how they move into years, and how years, in turn, bind up the life of man. We also know that our citizenship in eternity must be reaffirmed at the hour we do not know. Therefore, the individual preparing and building for a purposed future must have some concepts, some basic values upon which to build, because he is going to face this greater problem, perhaps sooner than he knows. It is therefore not well to be nostalgic or to be melancholy over these things, but to think about them constructively and to recognize nature's eternal providence in providing us with a magnificent machinery of our own immortality, that we have a life that will and does survive all change and goes on to the fulfillment of itself. And that conflict between this greater life and our way of living today is the principal reason for misery. Misery is not because we are good, but because we are not good. Misery is because the individual is not keeping faith with the pattern which is inevitable. And it would be so much wiser and happier for him if he kept the faith, and in that way enjoyed the full support of this pattern, instead of forever rebelling because of the strange spirit of self-will that is locked within his organism. The individual's way of peace, way of integration, way of soul release is through the acceptance of the plan of life. So the student studies the plan, and those who have graduated try to live it. And in so doing, they minimize their difficulties and augment their securities. The soul is still a mystery, but I think we can recognize it as the source of our capacity for emotional growth. And that emotional maturity is summed up in the simple concept of universal love and universal brotherhood. And that the soul which has in its roots no longer competitive attitudes and is no longer selfish, that soul is getting well. And if it recovers its health in due time, it will then be capable of leading the body to health, because it is the sickness within the psychic intensities of man which may most often be responsible for his physical troubles. Therefore, the purpose of the soul is to maintain the recognition of the beautiful, that all things in life are beautiful because they are orderly, because they are in proper relation and pattern with themselves and with each other, and that man worships most by bringing himself into harmony with life and into understanding with living things. The soul makes this bridge of understanding possible, and through the simple quickness of our sympathy, we can cross intervals that thoughts can never cross. And so by means of the soul, we make a beautiful life, giving it all the richness and overtone that we can. And through this beauty that we gradually, increasingly experience, we gain a greater insight into the one, into that one spirit which is at the source of both beauty and goodness, and that through the beautiful we approach the ineffable footstool of the eternal. For we cannot worship the eternal in anything except beauty and truth. And we cannot come into the presence of consciousness until conflict on a psychic level has ceased, because we have resolved all doubts and arbitrated all differences, and that we have discovered both the unity of life and the identity of the human need. So by wisdom and understanding, we temper, mature, and perfect the soul, and form of it what St. Paul so well describes as the golden wedding garment, the illumined soul into which we enter into the feast of the bridegroom. Here we recognize that the soul becomes the inner mystical vestment or body by which we are able to function in a more luminous sphere than the one that is here, and by which also we may in time live in those other mansions which exist in space for the growing and unfolding life of man himself. And as the body is taken from the earth, so the soul is taken from the air, like the ancient mistletoe, which is one of its symbols. But the soul of man becomes a body in time, a body of energies and emotions and thoughts, in which consciousness finds a more ample expression than it does here. Our purpose in the beginning is to try to mature soul, giving it thought and patience and understanding, and realize that as we grow in soul power, we solve problems, improve conditions, and make a valid step forward into this universe of eternal growth. Well, time is up. Now, got 2 or 3 announcements. There's one here which we make with exceptional pleasure, because in these difficult times it's always pleasant to announce something for free. The Friends of the Philosophical Research Society invite you to be with them at headquarters on Friday evening, July 20th at 7:30 p.m. That's at our building. And there is going to be a motion picture. In fact, there are going to be 2 motion pictures. Give a special bargain here. One is going to be a European film on the life and music of Mozart in connection with this festival. And the other is going to be a travel film. I haven't the detail on the travel film, but I understand it's very interesting. These films will be presented with no admission charge and no free will offering. It is definitely all for free. So that you are most cordially invited to come if you would like to make a little visit over and see what we're doing, and also become aware of the importance of some of this fine music. I'd like to also call to your attention the subject for next week, when we're going to talk a little bit about the broken heart and the offended pride. I remember a small boy who said one day that he was broken-hearted. He was about 3 or 4 years old. He said he was broken-hearted. And his mother said, well, what can we do about it? Well, he said, I think the thing that would help most would be an ice cream cone. Now, there is a certain amount of truth in that, even among the grown-ups. And many a time, an offended pride has been passed off as a broken heart. And sometimes a broken heart will hide under an offended pride and make an awfully complicated misery for itself, too. So next week we're going to consider some of these peculiar ulterior motives that we work into our attitudes and emotions, and which can have a little trouble for us. So many of the friends were interested in the little book of poems that we had on the sale for the table last week for the insignificant honorarium of 25 cents, that we have a few more. And if anyone likes them, many people seem to have found it very nice and have thanked us for having them. We were just able to offer them at this very ridiculously low price, so if anyone else wants them while we have them, they're welcome. We have a few more left. In connection with this morning, our lecture or note, our little booklet on essays on operative occultism might be helpful, and also some of our books. I think our self-unfoldment book would probably be pretty useful. Don't forget our seminar beginning Wednesday evening, where we're going to begin our discussion on the invisible bodies of man in Hindu philosophy. And the first one will be the study of the relationship of the physical body to the invisible body group. It will have some bearing upon material such as we were working with this morning. Also, we'd like to call to your attention that the festival at or the special concert at the Bell Club, the Mozart Festival Music, will be pretty soon now, And we suggest that if you're interested in attending this outstanding musical event of the season, which we are sponsoring in co-sponsorship with the Consul General of Austria, that you secure your tickets this morning while a good selection is available. As you know, the income from this concert above the actual cost of its production, and the artists are all accepting only a token remuneration. That everything above cost goes to the building fund of our society. So we hope that you will, if possible, attend this concert. And we hope to see you, a good many of you, Wednesday evening, and the rest next Sunday morning, when we'll try to save everybody from broken hearts and all that relates thereto.